Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Alexander Salter. Hello, Alexander. How are you doing?
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you as a guest, Alexander. And we're going to be talking about some of your articles and your views on space. Alexander, what can we expect to gain financially from from space exploration?
It's a very exciting time to be talking about space exploration because for the first time in human history, we're just on the teetering point where there's actually some private sector profitability and viability for a lot of this stuff. Now, I don't want to mislead any of your listeners. It's still the case that governments are the largest actors in space. Nonetheless, private actors have a larger role in space than ever before. You're probably familiar with SpaceX, the private launch services provider. They're doing amazing work. In addition, you have firms like Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin. In the short run, what I think that we're going to see is a robust sector for bringing human beings into low Earth orbit, either for servicing government contracts or maybe even for private space tourism. And longer term, I think we can even think about things like mining on the surface of the moon and Mars, and we can actually even begin to contemplate long-term settlements on surfaces other than the Earth. So that's pretty exciting.
Yes, I'm interested in the libertarian philosophy of space exploration posited by you and people like Walter Block, but I'm even more fascinated by the opportunities that will be available to us because of space investment. So for the average person sitting down in a room listening to us, clearly you have conveyed your arguments quite eloquently, but I'm thinking about an idea to invest in space that maybe most of us are not thinking about. So, for example, there's space tourism, space mining. What else can we do?
Those are both great examples.
Yeah,
Those are probably the two most commercially viable ones immediately. You can also think of firms that might specialize in space debris removal. So, right now, one of the biggest environmental problems is actually not on Earth, but above Earth. The orbits around Earth, especially low Earth orbit, are getting a little bit crowded with space junk, what we call space debris. And that poses a problem to the integrity of orbit because when you have all this space junk up there, you run the risk that it collides with a useful space asset like a live satellite. And there's always the prospect that all that space debris collides with other debris, resulting in a sort of positive feedback loop where you just have more and more space junk messing up more and more stuff. So at some point, we're going to need to remove debris from orbit and find a way of getting that stuff deorbited. And so, where there's a service to be provided that people are willing to pay for, chances are there's going to be an entrepreneur who finds a way to take advantage of those services and make those payments. And so, I am particularly excited by the prospects of debris mitigation and removal services by the private sector. I think that that's something we can look forward to in the not too distant future.
I am thinking just a little deeper. I don't know enough about the physical resources of space, but I am a fan of energy resources, and I'm wondering if there's a possibility that elements in space may be able to solve energy problems. That's something that I've been looking into.
There's a lot of fascinating potentials for space. There's potentials for exploration, there's potentials for settlement, there's environmental concerns, there's experiments. There's really no frontier of human endeavor that cannot be improved by making a renewed commitment to space activity. Now, there are some sticking points in the sense that a lot of these activities are going to be increasingly associated with geopolitical tensions here on Earth. The three major spacefaring nations are the United States, Russia, and China. And obviously, the United States doesn't have the best of relations with Russia. And right now, things are positively antagonistic with respect to China. And so you might worry that domestic space activities get caught up in that sort of international politicking rivalry. So I'm not sure that there's anything avoidable about that. That's just going to be something that we have to take for granted. There is a benefit to keeping space an open access domain for all peaceful actors. And so I think that that should be our focus in the short to medium run.
All right. And Alexander, you're interested in property rights. How do we design property rights for the celestial realm?
Excellent question. So the basic thing to understand about property rights for outer space is it's not clear there can be any sovereign enforcer. The basic treaty governing outer space is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. Article 2 of that treaty explicitly prohibits the extension of territorial jurisdiction to the heavenly bodies. What does that mean? That means that no country can establish resource claims, no country can establish enforced by public courts property rights claims to real estate, celestial land, right, whether on the moon or on Mars. So that means, in all likelihood, if we're going to have any sort of property rights regime, it's going to be privately devised and privately enforced. You're going to have a self-enforcing regime for property rights that exists between commercial actors that's enforced by a private, voluntarily agreed to space code for the allocation and distribution of celestial resources. Now, there's many ways that that can go. We might think of a space social contract where all the major space players in the private sector set the rules of the game, or we might think of a sort of bottom-up evolutionary legal code and legal system as existed, for example, on Earth during the High Middle Ages, when the so-called Lex Mercatoria or commercial law revived in the High Middle Ages that facilitated a lot of international trade. I think that that would be a great model to bring to space with us. But either way, what we're going to see is that nation states, beyond basically acting as celestial referees to police their nationals in space, there's not going to be a whole lot that governments do with respect to enforcing property rights, at least given current public international space law. So that does pose some challenges, but it also poses some interesting opportunities for non-state governance in this important human sector.
Exactly my point. So I'm wondering, at some stage, will we be pondering homesteading for space?
Will it be what for space?
Pondering homesteading for space.
Homesteading for space. That's the exciting thing, right? In terms of appropriating resource claims. So the problem with homesteading is we usually use the analogy of homesteading land in the United States on the Western frontier. And the difficulty there was that the land previously belonged or was under the jurisdiction of the federal government. And the federal government said, if you establish a homestead here, occupy it, improve the land, we will recognize your private property rights to that land that you improve and you occupy. Here, though, the land doesn't belong to the federal government. In fact, the land doesn't belong to any government. It belongs to mankind as a whole, as recognized in international treaty. So the question is, what can be done with respect to celestial real estate? At least as public international space law currently stands, it's not clear you can have private ownership to the actual physical real estate on Martian surfaces or the surface of the moon or anything like that. But it's also not clear that you need to, right? If you have a self-enforcing legal regime amongst commercial actors, they can recognize that I can't interfere with your ongoing operations without recognizing your exclusive property right to the land itself. Of course, another really big, difficult to implement option is that the nations that actually go into space get together and modify public international space law and actually change the legal regime such that property rights are explicitly permitted and enforced at the national level. But the likelihood of that is very, very small. This all has to be done via treaty, which means that all has to be done by self-enforcing agreements among political sovereigns. And again, given the major players in space are the United States, Russia, and China, and their interests are broadly not in line with each other's interests, it's unclear that we're going to get buy-in on any proposal which could win the support of those three governments. So in terms of what we're going to observe in terms of celestial homesteading, I think it's going to have to be something that the private sector takes the lead on, and then we're going to see how the legal code evolves around that.
I agree with you, Alexander. And to be honest, I don't believe that powerful states like Russia, China, and America are precluded from investing in space, but due to their economic realities at the present moment, it may not be feasible. But Alex, if we continue along this path, at some point, people will be contending that developing countries are being excluded from space.
In fact, they're already claiming that now. One of the crucial issues in outer space was making sure that outer space remained a domain for all mankind to peacefully access, operate in, and explore. Now that's all well and good, right? That's a very noble motivation. But in terms of the actual allocation and distribution of space resources, what does it mean? There's one big international treaty that did not secure any consent among the major spacefaring nations. That's the 1979 Moon Treaty. And this treaty explicitly said anything like private property rights by anybody in outer space is off the table, especially on the surface of the moon or below the surface of the moon when we're talking about minerals. And because you had this very strong anti-property rights, anti-commerce mindset in that treaty, you didn't get consent to that treaty by any nation that has a major space presence. And so you had a lot of ratification of that treaty by developing nations that wanted to make sure that the low-hanging space fruit, so to speak, wouldn't be picked by the leading spacefaring nations. But again, the trick about all this is that because space is not within any one sovereign's jurisdiction, the only rules that nation states have to respect are those rules that they voluntarily agree to. So you're never going to get a system for space law that disprivileges the leading nations at the expense of nations that haven't quite caught up yet with their space program. So we're going to have to find some other way to ameliorate those conflicts between nations that arise.
All right. Alexander, a brilliant idea is emanating from my head, or should I rather say my brain. Mining. Mining is a touchy sector, but it's still crucial. In the near future, when space exploration becomes more prominent, I don't like to make predictions, but I am predicting that the elements that we're going to explore and research in space, many of them will be highly valuable. And because they're so highly valuable, another objection to the free market economics of space is how do we prevent some actors in the private economy from creating monopoly rents?
Great question. So there's absolutely a lot of value in space mining, whether we're talking about below the surface of the moon or Mars, even more so with certain asteroids that occasionally pass within regular and predictable orbits of the Earth. There's often rare earth metals, other metals that have extraordinarily high market values here on Earth. The question is, can we actually go out there and get that stuff and bring it back? So what we have to worry about is that one or a small number of firms will get a leg up on these things and will pick all the low-hanging fruit, right? That's sort of the claim about worries about monopoly rents. But what I think is particularly intriguing and what makes me optimistic about the prospects of space mining is precisely the legal environment for space that says nobody can prevent anybody from accessing outer space. So because of that, you sort of have an open and a level playing field. And even if some firms get a leg up on other firms, there's a lot of stuff out there in space. Space is huge. Even just the area around Earth's orbit is huge. There's going to be plenty of opportunities to find and exploit resources, bring those resources back to Earth. And what that's going to do is that's going to bring down the prices for a lot of these crucial metals that serve as an input good for so many goods and services. Those are going to be cost savings that are passed on into consumers, and it's going to be a serious engine driving economic growth for nations as a whole. So I'm particularly optimistic. I'm not too worried about one or a small number of firms monopolizing space, precisely because one of the things that national governments are obliged to do is make sure that space remains an open access regime. Nobody is allowed to prevent somebody else from accessing orbit. Does this mean that there's not going to be any conflict? Of course not. There's going to be conflicts that arise. If somebody lands a mining robot on an asteroid, how far do they claims go, right? Do they own the entire asteroid? Do they only own the mineral veins that they drill or that they go to extract? There is going to be conflicts that arise out of specific interactions between commercial players. And that's why I think what we should err on the side of is a bottom-up evolutionary commercial code for space rather than a top-down space social contract.
I get your point quite clearly, Alexander, but if space ought to be free, this means that none of us can be excluded from appropriating resources in space. But if I appropriate a section of space, then that is my property.
If you appropriate a section of space and claim it as your property,
Yeah,
almost certainly inconsistent with public international law as it stands today. And so just because you're operating in space doesn't mean that your domestic government cannot police you. In fact, the various nations of the world have a responsibility enshrined in treaty to police their nationals in space. So if somebody wanted to go to Mars, plant a private flag and say, there, now all of Mars is mine, the United States government has both the right and the duty to police that agent and say, hey, what you're doing right now is contrary to international law. You need to stop making these claims or we're going to forcibly stop you from making those claims. So this, I think, highlights the value of governments, earthly sovereigns, as space referees, making sure that no one player tries to monopolize rents, tries to monopolize real estate. In that sense, there is a valuable role for governments to play if we can get them to play it. But at the same time, in terms of staking new resource claims, in terms of exploiting celestial wealth, that's something that's going to be disproportionately done, if not entirely done, by the private sector. So I think what space as a whole represents is a unique opportunity to redraw the boundaries in commerce between private and public. Private actors produce wealth, public actors make sure that the rules of the game for creating that wealth are maintained and justly enforced, with the stipulation that no earthly government can do anything like claim an exclusive right to enforce rules between players in space.
So, Alexander, are you saying that the state is a sensible umpire in the arena of space issues?
I'm saying that we can hope that it will be. Now, obviously, if you know a thing or two about public policy, and if you're a classical liberal, libertarian, or even a conservative, this sounds like a rather heroic assumption to make about states, because states aren't normally in the interest of policing in the interests of the common welfare of humankind, right? They have their own political interests, their own incentives to which they're responding. What I'm hoping is that the environment for space operations creates a network of incentives and information generating processes where earthly governments are compelled by political necessity to be relatively hands off, except in their umpiring roles. Whether things turn out that way is anybody's guess. Like you said, predictions are hard, especially about the future, right? To use the famous Yogi Berra expression. So there's always a possibility that states can do this, the usual thing that states do, and muck this up. But I'm cautiously optimistic that we can draw the right boundaries between private wealth creation and public rule enforcement on a limited basis. It's not appropriate for the United States to say that it's going to go and police German nationals in space or Russian nationals in space. But the US can police US nationals in space. In fact, it has to do so. It's bound by treaty to do that. So I think that we have a relatively good shot of keeping these activities between reasonable bounds, but we got to make sure that we get these things right, especially in the early eras of the early years of this new space age. As those years progress, we have a unique chance to set the rules of the game and get the bottom-up processes right. And I think that that could potentially have ramifications for decades, if not centuries.
Alexander, shed some light on the Space Act of 2015. You mentioned it in your paper titled Order in the Cosmos, Private Law and Celestial Property Rights.
Yes, that's right. So the Space Launch Competitive Act of 2015 had this very controversial proposition or provision in it, which said that the United States government would recognize its citizens' claims to celestial wealth. It is not 100% clear that that piece of legislation, which again passed both houses of Congress and was signed by the president, was one of the last bills signed by President Obama. It's not clear that that bill is consistent with public international space law. Because again, one of the foundational principles of public international space law is that no state may extend its territorial jurisdiction to the heavenly bodies anywhere in space. Right? The surface of the moon is not US territory. The surface of an asteroid cannot become US territory. The surface of Mars cannot become US territory. The question is, if the United States government recognizes US citizens' claims to celestial wealth, meaning that they will defend those claims in international and national courts, does that represent a de facto extension of territorial jurisdiction? Some legal experts say yes. Some legal experts say no. So this is an ongoing debate within current public international space law. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a comparative advantage at adjudicating those legal claims. What I've specialized in is understanding the economic ramifications of these debates. So I think that we can expect the space economy to play out in a little bit different ways, depending on whether the consensus of the international space legal community is whether acts like these are consistent with space law as it currently exists or is inconsistent with space law as it currently exists.
Alexander, you keep belaboring international law. Why should we care about international law?
That's the basic question, right? Ultimately, we have to care about international law because we care about fair play between nations. And as long as we want to have continued peaceful relations with other nations, we have to care a bit about what they do. They have to care a little bit about what we do. And we all have to respect basic norms that have been long established either through treaty or custom or just longstanding enforcement. Because space is an international commons in the sense of, this is a very specific claim, right? you sometimes get people abusing this concept of commons in the legal sense and conflating it with economic commons. They're not at all the same thing. Space is a commons in the sense that no state can restrict any other state's access to space. That's one of the foundational principles of public international space law. And ultimately, what we need is buy-in among sovereigns, among earthly governments on these principles. Because what happens if we don't? Well, then we get what you might call the bad kind of a space race. Without respecting the basic rules of the game, you might worry that domestic governments are going to try and impose their interests on other nations using space. You might have a race for the militarization of space. You might have a race for the government-sponsored colonization of space. Now, these are things that could very quickly get out of hand and have deleterious consequences for human wealth and welfare here on Earth. So the ultimate reason that we need to care about international law in this context is we don't want space to become an all or nothing winner takes all tournament. We want to keep the stakes low. We want to keep potentials for peaceful and profitable cooperation high. So that way, no state has any incentive to engage in too much realpolitik up there.
All right, Alexander, fair points. Some libertarians could be skeptical of your arguments, but they're skeptical due to their misguided assumptions. International law is influenced by customary law, intellectual expertise, and the cultural context. So in the realm of space, international law can also adjudicate conflicts as a matter of custom. One does not need to be a partner to any of these treaties to be a subject of international law, because you can treat it as custom.
Yes, that's true. Once a principle of international law that's originally established by treaty becomes so repeatedly relied on and so entrenched in custom that it becomes a legal principle of its own, it's no longer the case that other states need to explicitly consent to it. There's going to come a point where if public international space law is not changed, if we don't further modify the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, for example, there's going to come a point where that's so entrenched in public international law that up and coming nation states in space are simply going to be compelled to accept it or at least respect it as a matter of customary international law. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is something that's being imposed on them and it's not fair and it's strong nations exploiting weak. That's absolutely not the case. Custom in international law is one of the greatest safeguards for weaker states against stronger states when those stronger states might be tempted to abuse their position of strength and impose their viewpoints and their interests on weaker states. We also have to consider the potential for voluntary international arbitration bodies to hear space arbitration claims. There are various international arbitration bodies that are already setting up procedures to arbitrate space disputes. Now, this is a case where you actually have voluntary arbitration. The enforcer is not a nation state backed by a military or soft power or anything like that. Instead, it's voluntary arbitration in the sense that the penalty for not respecting the outcome of that space arbitration agreement is that other actors are going to recognize that you are not behaving in good faith, and so they're not going to cooperate with you in your future space endeavors. So I'm optimistic that we're going to find a lot of governance solutions to space problems that do not explicitly rely on the guns of government.
I agree. States usually comply with international law. Academic articles have been written on the topic. Why do states comply with international law? They comply with international law because the costs of defecting are too great. So they comply. So if international law is treated as custom, it does not require the force of government. And secondly, Alexander, can your principle of polycentric sovereignty be applied to space?
Ooh, very interesting question. So you've gotten actually into some technical concepts from a very different literature that I've been working on. So this idea, polycentric sovereignty, I actually developed with a co-author and friend and colleague of mine, Andrew Young, who's also an economics professor here at Texas Tech. Guns up, go Red Raiders. And so we developed the idea of polycentric sovereignty in the context of explaining the political institutions, not in space, but here on Earth from a millennia ago. We were talking about the political arrangements of Europe during the High Middle Ages, roughly starting to get off the ground around 1000 AD and really culminating in the 13th century. And a system is characterized by polycentric sovereignty if, on the one hand, political authority is fractured, overlapping, and concurrent, meaning there's no monopoly enforcer of law and order, and if governance providers have incentives to act in a way that's conducive to social wealth creation. Given that governance setup, you can expect good rules to emerge out of whatever de facto constitutions are on the ground, even if you have no formal, explicitly written down constitution or social contract. The question is that model applicable to space? It might be eventually, but polycentric sovereignty is usually something that you see after years and years and years of repeated, established interactions between actors in some social context. So I think that we might hope that over decades or even centuries, the combination of private and public activities in space might result in a constitution de facto, not de jure, that balances power and makes sure that every space actor acts in a responsible manner. But as of right now, I think it's just too early to speculate on the eventual properties of the celestial constitution, so to speak. I think that what we should focus on in the short run is making sure that the initial rules for going and exploring space, extracting space resources, setting up settlements, conducting new science experiments, even closer to home, things like space tourism, making sure all of those rules give people the right incentives to behave well in space. And then longer term, we can talk about these issues like balance of power, making sure that no organization has a possession of monopolies on law and order, or no entity has monopoly rights to space resources. We want to make sure that those things are off the table to keep space peaceful.
Well, Alexander, I don't have a PhD like yourself, but whenever I'm reading or analyzing an issue, I often get to the point. And after getting to the point, I tended to think about policies that will be relevant within the next 10 years or 20 years. And another idea is as just touch me, the idea of intellectual property. In the future, neither of us are real experts in intellectual property, but I'm just throwing out the idea out there. In the future, how do we deal with intellectual property issues? Originally, some ideas that were deemed to be ordinary were never able to benefit from IP rights. But we live in an age where people are patenting processes, they're even patenting genes. What are we going to do when some entrepreneurs create processes to make space exploration and space mining more efficient, and then they say we're going to get a patent? How do we deal with these issues?
That's a great question. And I'm going to be honest with you, that's not something that I've yet explicitly considered. Intellectual property is obviously a very complex issue, especially for those who identify as libertarian, classical, liberal, conservative, the body of philosophies that broadly respect free enterprise and the rule of law and limited government. So you might worry that a space mining entity uncovers a viable way to acquire space resources. It patents that production process and thereby insulates itself from competition, at least for some limited time horizon. So in that sense, it's undesirable. It's exclusively claiming a monopoly right to a specific production process, an idea, right? Something that's not scarce, not rivalrous. And that's something that a lot of libertarians look on with great skepticism. On the other hand, you might worry that without that idea protection, that investments in valuable new space technologies themselves wouldn't be made in the first place. And so in order to make those investments to benefit consumers today, you have to be guaranteed protection of your rights, at least to that costly to produce idea tomorrow. I think the most likely situation that's going to arise when we're talking about space is, frankly, the rate of technological innovation is going to be so great that I'm actually personally not very worried about any one production process being monopolized. There's always a way to build a better mousetrap. And we're seeing that with even terrestrial technologies, right? The intellectual property rights system probably makes new ideas production and generation a little less competitive at the margin than it otherwise would. But that hasn't stopped technological innovation. That hasn't stopped us from coming up with new ideas and better ways of doing things. And I ultimately think that what happens on Earth is also going to happen in space. The first space mining company might try and patent a production process. Clever entrepreneurs will think up another one. I understand that a lot of people are skeptical of that argument because of the high costs of accessing space at all. But you have to realize that those costs are rapidly coming down, right? Just look at the cost of getting into orbit. From 1970 up until 2000, the cost of getting to space was about $18,000 per kilogram. Now, thanks to innovations in reusable rocketry, that figure is something like $2,800 per kilogram, right? A massive reduction thanks to all this innovation that we're seeing. So I think that we might be on the cusp of a technological breakthrough in terms of accessing and using space. You have multiple companies right now that are working on reusable rockets. I'm sure that SpaceX has a bunch of patents for the way that they do their reusable rockets. That's not stopping other firms from investing and exploring new ways of doing reusable rocketry. And I take that as a good sign that intellectual property laws are not going to stop mankind's reach into the final frontier.
And I agree with you 150%. Innovations are likely without IP laws, and in some cases, IP laws can deter the rate of innovation. It's always better to ensure the free flow of innovative ideas.
I agree. Ideas are a good thing. My initial standpoint on all this is I look at the fundamental resource in question and ask, is the good in question scarce? Does it need to be allocated? Does it need to be protected? When it comes to ideas, ideas, of course, are non-rivalrous and non-excludable. It's not clear to me that we need an intellectual property rights scheme to protect those ideas. Now, skeptics would reply, that's exactly why we do need an intellectual property rights scheme, right? Because if investors can't profit from costly to produce ideas that can just be stolen or replicated by second-handers, right, at zero cost, nobody's going to go through the time and effort of thinking of new ideas. Well, that's a testable hypothesis, right? The question is, did we see technological innovation in eras when protecting ideas, protecting intellectual property wasn't feasible? And the answer is yes.
Yes.
Throughout human history, we did see technological innovation, even when ideas could not be protected as property. So I admit that my belief is not super confident in this, but if you pushed me, I would call myself on the whole an IP skeptic.
No, I agree. And again, we are both agreeing. During the Industrial Revolution, the patent system in Britain was not particularly effective. And furthermore, in that era, British inventors were often more willing to share their ideas with other inventors in comparison to other countries in Europe. So without a doubt, even in the absence of intellectual property, people will innovate. And studies have shown that when prospective innovators are paid to create fascinating works, they are less motivated to do so because many innovators are motivated by future rewards. They want to be remembered. It's more important that they are remembered for creating the innovation than getting money.
I think that that's right. There are non-pecuniary motivations here that ultimately drive inventiveness, that drive entrepreneurial talent. In the late Middle Ages and during early modernity, when you had bards, singers and songwriters wandering the land to sing their songs and try and acquire fame, they didn't want their ideas protected. They wanted their songs sung as widely as possible so they would become famous. And so I think that there's an argument there that a lot, not all, but a lot of technological innovation works the same name. The desire for fame, the desire for regard, right? The desire to be esteemed by
psychic
rewards.
rewards.
There are these psychic rewards, and I think that economists sometimes go wrong when they rule out non-pecuniary motivations. I think that these other motivations are very strong.
Well, economists are maturing. People like Peter Moser, they have been producing some exceptional studies.
That's exciting to hear. Economics is a very exciting field right now, especially when it comes to institutions and institutional change, because we're starting to tackle these very difficult ideas that not everything that matters is just a simple financial reward. Now, the danger with embracing non-pecuniary returns as an explanation for human behavior is that it's an excuse to engage in squishy statements that can't really be falsified. I fully concede that, right? It's very easy to posit some other motivation and say, oh, people aren't maximizing wealth, they're maximizing this other variable. That's conveniently impossible to measure, so there's no way to falsify my hypothesis. But Economists are coming up with new and innovative ways to look at those avenues of human endeavor and actually say, okay, assuming that people are maximizing over a broad spectrum of goals that include but is not limited to wealth, that also includes things like fame, esteem, other kinds of fortune, what predictable, refutable implications arise from those models? And we're seeing really, really interesting ways of analyzing human experiences, not just with statistical data, but analytic narratives, digging into the historical archives. Economists are very, very inventive at coming up with new testable and refutable hypotheses, even when it comes to these difficult to acquire subjects. So I'm optimistic about the state of the economics literature and institutions, institutional change and economic development over the next 5 to 10 years. It's a very exciting field.
Alexander, all desires are motivated by wealth if we redefine the concept of wealth. So I'm fond of studying African history. In the Asante Empire, wealth was valued, but it was seen as communal. And in other parts of Africa, both in the past and today, a followership is crucial to success. So if an entrepreneur develops a large following, he wants to maintain the following. And sometimes in order to increase his following, he may need to engage in activities that are counter wealth creation, or they may appear to be counter wealth. So I would argue that wealth has to be redefined. And if we redefine wealth to include reputational wealth, then all activities are motivated by the desire for wealth.
It's a very Misesian point that you're making. This is something that Mises emphasized repeatedly in human action. If we want to understand human behavior, we need to focus on the fact that action is necessarily purposive. To act is to try and substitute a more desirable state of affairs for a less desirable state of affairs. The question then arises, what constitutes a more valuable or less valuable state of affairs? You have to get into the intentional framework of the human actor himself or herself. If they value pecuniary wealth, that's pecuniary wealth. If they value other things, psychic wealth, then that means psychic wealth. There are all sorts of avenues of human endeavor that you probably cannot, well, I shouldn't say probably, that you simply cannot explain if your goal is dollar wealth maximization. If you're talking about the amount of physical goods and services, there are a host of other goods that human beings care about. And that's not a counter economics point. That's exclusively in line with economics properly understood. Because economics at the end of the day is about understanding why human beings do what they do. It is the social science par excellence. And I think that we could all use another dose of what Mises tried so hard to tell us in human action.
Well, to be honest, Alexander, many of the ideas that I have read pertaining to Mises, I discovered them before reading him. So maybe we just need better thinkers. I don't have a problem with the inductive method. The inductive method had its place, but earlier thinkers were more deductive. And I think we need to develop a greater level of appreciation for the deductive method.
Yes, the deductive method in economic theory is underrated, I think, especially by today's economists. And when we say deductive method, you can have a framework for interpreting human behavior that starts from a core proposition, and then you derive implications for what people will do and when from that framework. The goal is then taking that framework to the data, so to speak, human history, human experience, and seeing what you can understand with that deductive framework used as your analytical window or lens. Unfortunately, too many economists today think I don't need to worry about economic theory. I can just let the data tell me about what the relationships are. That doesn't work.
And this is why these days when I read economic studies, the conclusions can be distinct from the abstract and the data, because analysts are empirical. They care about the experiment and how people approach situations in real life. But research tends to lack a theoretical underpinning. And this is why usually when writers are concluding, they will also state that the conclusion is inconclusive. It's an inconclusive conclusion because it lacks a proper theoretical framework.
I think that that's right. And you can understand it very well by using the distinction between what Mises called theory and history. For Mises, theory means the frameworks, the deductive a priori frameworks that we use to interpret human behavior and human experience. History is the contingent human behaviors that manifest in a specific time and a specific context that are partly interpreted through our deductive frameworks and then also partly interpreted through comparative institutional theory, which contains a little bit of both. And so the more that you do history, the more that you try and explain specific contingent human behavior or behaviors in a pre-specified historical environment, the less you can actually make a generalizable claim about human experience in general. That's not necessarily a bad thing. If we want to understand why Bob did activity X at time Y, we absolutely have to do history as Mises understood it. That just means that we need to be careful in not thinking that what Bob did in that context is generalizable to other contexts. But to properly do history, you need economic theory. There's no such thing as just the facts. You always have an interpretive filter through which your empirical claims are being interpreted and adjudicated. Our choice isn't between theory and no theory. Our only choice is between good, explicit, consistent theory or inarticulate, fuzzy, not explicitly confronted theory. We want to be very clear about what our theories are, what predictions they offer, and what they can say about human endeavors and human behavior in specific historical contexts. I think that that's the best model for doing social science.
We reject inartful assumptions, and a perfect case study is the research on colonialism. The quantitative aspect is sound, but the theoretical aspect is inapt. Let me give a perfect example. The political economy of colonialism. New studies on colonialism have demonstrated that British colonialists had to cooperate with locals, and by locals, I'm referring to the chiefs. Failure to do so would have made it more difficult to manage the process of colonialism. So when we interpret colonialism using the political economy approach, the results are different and they seem more understandable. It's just like the issue of colonial law. The British common law often incorporated customs, but at the same time, the British, well, I shouldn't say rulers, but British kingmakers, then they found it quite complicated to manage a space without the input of their chiefs. And the chiefs in Africa, they recognize their power, and as such, they employed that strategy to increase social power and undermine competing chiefs. So when we assess colonialism using the political economy approach, the results are different.
I'm not terribly familiar with the literature on colonialism, but what you're telling me certainly sounds plausible. Ultimately, we have to be very careful in paying attention to the incentives created by top-down interventions. The story that you just told me sounds plausible, that when you had colonial overseers intervening in the affairs of natives on the ground, it often came with incentives for unusual coalitions to arise between the colonial powers and the colonized to form factions against others of the colonized. Now, that might be contrary to what you find in a lot of other literatures, but human behavior is weird like that. Incentives can be strange and fickle things. They often get people to behave in ways that you wouldn't expect. That's the law of unintended consequences. So while I can't speak to the specific historical episodes that you're talking about, I think that what you're saying illustrates that the reason that we need economics and political economy as social sciences is because those disciplines are uniquely situated to help us understand the bizarre and often counterintuitive way that incentives can result in changes in human behavior.
Exactly my point. And a brilliant economist is not necessarily a philosopher, but it pays when an economist has as a cursory view of philosophy. It doesn't need to be too highfalutin, but it pays when an economist can appreciate philosophy.
I think economists can and should read philosophy. I think that economists can and should read mathematics, political science, ethics. A whole range of topics are relevant to understanding human decision-making. F.A. Hayek, who's absolutely one of my favorite economists, famously said, famously said, nobody can be a good economist who is only an economist. And the point that he was making is that to understand purposive human action, to understand why people do what they do and the durable, what you might say, the equilibrium results of human behavior, to really get behind those processes, you needed to cultivate knowledge from multiple fields. If all you have is pecuniary wealth maximization, you're simply not going to understand that much about human activity. You need to incorporate other concerns as well.
Well, Alexander, if money is your only passion, you may never acquire it. And if you do, you're going to remain unhappy. The passion of the productive man should be to create value. When you create value, you will accumulate wealth. Job creation is a consequence of value creation. In order to create value, one must be passionate about creating value.
Absolutely correct. If you interview any of the great entrepreneurs from the last 10, 20 years, they're all going to say the same thing. They were not motivated consciously primarily by getting rich. Does that mean they didn't want to get rich? Of course not. But it meant that what drove them, what pushed them to keep on going when everybody told them their idea didn't make sense, when they had failure after failure and still tried again, what pushed them and compelled them to keep going was the vision of creating value for other people in a unique and revolutionary way. Of course, the money's great. Of course, it's wonderful to become wealthy. But if that's all people are after, they are not going to stick it out through the darkest time periods of their lives. People want dignity, they want respect, they want the esteem of their peers, they want to make a meaningful contribution to human society. And it's the genius of free enterprise that all of these higher goods, all of these humanistic concerns that are absolutely valid, become linked at the margin with personal profitability. That's why the free enterprise system is so successful. That's really why it's the only feasible model for commerce going into the 21st century.
It's like this show. So I'm a researcher and business analyst. I work and I write and I get paid. I like to make money. Making money is not bad. But the purpose of this YouTube channel is to disseminate quality information to my listeners by creating value for them at a low cost. So today I'm speaking to you, an expert, and my listeners, they're consuming the material for free and they are not forking out thousands to pay you. Whereas in another dispensation, one would have paid you, let's say, $100,000. I'm just joking. I don't know how much you're paid if you get paid to do speeches, but you get the point. You know, dispensation, you're paid a lot of money to give a fancy speech, or maybe a speech that is not even as intellectual as the present conversation because of the context. So that's the purpose of this show, to create value to people at no cost.
One of my graduate school mentors, Peter Becky over at George Mason.
I interviewed him.
That's wonderful. I think I saw him on your list of interviewees. Yeah. One of his favorite phrases, it goes something like, ideas are like fire that light the minds of men. And ultimately, it's these ideas and the passion for conceiving ways of organizing human society. And by organizing, I don't mean top down, right? I mean showing people bottom up through experimentation, showing people what can be possible and winning people's assent to those ideas. I think that that's ultimately the primary motivator in human history. Does money matter? Of course it matters. Does wealth matter? Of course it matters. But if that's all that matters, there's going to be a lot of human history that is not perfectly explainable. There's going to be a lot of human experience that's closed off to you, even as you yourself act that way. You and I are acting that way right now, as you just usefully pointed out. So if that's all we're doing, if that's all we're waiting for, if all we care about is pecuniary returns, what are we doing here?
Exactly, it would be pointless. But interestingly, Alexander, this show has created value and it has reaped financial reward. Remember, what do we mean by wealth? Wealth refers to our network. So I interview you, you become a part of my network. By using your platform, I can get someone with an even larger network. So if we think about wealth in a superficial sense, we're always going to remain poor.
What is the ultimate source of wealth? The human mind.
I was just, yes,
right?
Ideas.
It's the Matt Ridley point. It's ideas, it's innovation. And that only comes from people. And so absolutely, it's wonderful to have these networks where we can try out ideas, where we can pick them apart, where we can combine them, where we can put them back together again, where we can see where the potentials for human innovation and human gain are. That's the ball game. That's ultimately going to be the driver of social wealth creation.
Yeah, your value to get wealth, one must create value. So if so for instance, some like to criticize YouTube by arguing that many of these YouTubers who make millions are waste of time. I'm not going to comment on their efficacy, but what I will say is that they're making millions because they identify social trends and they're able to provide what people want in a charismatic manner. So you may not go on YouTube to listen to a cat video, but there's a market for cat videos. So don't begrudge the YouTuber for making cat videos. Find a way to create value and make your own money.
Let people enjoy things.
Exactly my point.
It's fine.
It's just like these stupid articles on Yahoo News with titles like celebrities we believe don't deserve their fame, or YouTubers who are making too much money. Crappy articles. These YouTubers, many of them started to do videos when they were children, very, very young people. So as expected, they would have gotten more time to develop their craft. So you cannot begrudge people for being successful. If your passion is not creating value, maybe your passion should become a hobby, and then you need to invest in another medium that can create some more value. And I keep repeating myself because value is really important. People think that entrepreneurship is about job creation. No, it's about creating value.
Yes, and there are certainly ways that people can create value that other people might disapprove of. There are some ways of creating value for some people that might come at the expense of other people. That's all reasonable. We can talk about the limits of that. But the basic proposition that people are creating value and offering it to others on terms that those others voluntarily accept, that should at minimum give us prima facie reason not to interfere with those operations, and certainly not to introduce violence into those operations. Are there exceptions? Of course there are. But nonetheless, I think the default should be to let human beings experiment with ways to create value for other human beings.
And do you know what's the next frontier in value creation? The metaverse. And I will not define it because I think that it is better at this point to obfuscate. Politicians can't regulate what they don't understand.
They frequently do.
Yeah,
They frequently do.
yes, but the metaverse, I've been doing a lot of reading on the metaverse. Maybe you have been doing so too, I don't know. But what I will say is this: the metaverse is not virtual reality. It's virtual reality with consequences for real life. So if you're playing a game using cryptocurrency, but you can redeem the currency for legitimate money, this has real world implications. But how can the government regulate a character in a video game?
Somehow, I don't think that's going to stop them from trying.
I have many brilliant ideas. Some of them are too good to share, but I will share this one. It's too laughable to be real. Meme stocks. So crypto, there are several popular meme stocks at the moment. And I was reading Yahoo News some time ago, and the founder of our Reddit platform was talking about Nancy Pelosi and their portfolio. Portfolio apparently it is doing well. So I said to myself, okay then, why not create an exchange for meme stocks? And these meme stocks will be reflecting the portfolios of prominent people. It's copycat investing. So we don't know the portfolio of Peter Thiel. When he speaks, we can get insight into his portfolio, but we don't know the true extent of his portfolio. So we would feed the data to the algorithm, and then the algorithm will determine the valuation. Why is the valuation important? If we're going to create a platform online to list a portfolio, clearly people will be buying shares, and if you're going to buy a share, a valuation must be done. So we do a valuation, get the share price, and trade these meme stocks. I think it's an interesting idea. What do you think?
It sounds exciting. You're going a little bit beyond my area of competence. My sole investing activity is to put money in mutual funds and then ignore it. So it sounds like you've given me a lot more, given this a lot more thought than I have. But I think you should go for it. I think you should try
Yeah,
and set it up.
and my show, luckily for me, is not popular yet. So I can afford, well, this is one of the ideas that I think I can afford to lose, but I think the market will do well. If people are investing in cryptocurrency, that's quite risky. Why can't they invest in a stock that is reflecting a real portfolio and a portfolio that's actually performed? So that performs. So we could call the Pelosi portfolio Pelosi Premium.
It would certainly also have the benefit of shedding a little bit more light on the investments of important public officials, and maybe would even serve as another means of disciplining them. So that could be exciting.
Yeah, but the possibilities for the metaverse are just unlimited. It's obviously, I don't think you are fond of conspiracy theories, but it could even facilitate a betting market for conspiracy theories, a betting market for movies. We don't have a proper betting market for stocks as yet. So the possibilities are really unlimited. And this is where you come in. You conceptualize polycentric sovereignty. So when the metaverse unfolds, you're going to be producing more papers applying polycentric sovereignty to govern the metaverse.
Sounds ambitious. I like ambitious.
Yes, so even today on YouTube, I saw something and a video on metaverse stocks, but none of these stocks are truly metaverse companies as yet. They're companies like Facebook that are interested in pursuing the metaverse. But as you said, Alexander, politicians will regulate what they don't understand.
That's what they do all too often. Not only politicians, but unfortunately, not even economists have sufficiently appreciated the Hayekian and Misesian arguments for knowledge generation and social processes like the market. If we really understood what Hayek was talking about in economics and knowledge, if we really understood the mechanics behind Mises's articles and the book on the socialist calculation debate, what we would come up with is a generalizable framework for understanding feedback and behavior governance in a way that just can't be done by distant bureaucrats or regulators or politicians in a top-down fashion. So it would be nice if we could get that knowledge more widely known.
What's also quite compelling, Alexander, is that the metaverse can be interpreted as a group of mini states. People are already talking about meta nations. So if you sign on to a platform and you become a member of, let's say, Lipton's Metaverse 1, you're a citizen of Lipton's Metaverse, I have jurisdiction over my metaverse. Can the government tell my citizens what to do? Will they find a way?
Digital citizenship, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I was speaking to a prominent economist and I shared an idea with him and he said, really interesting. It's only that the regulations may beat it. And I said, no, if we create a form of digital citizenship, then the regulations won't beat it. And then you respond by saying they will find a way to do so. So that's just my only problem. No, I don't want the government to impede us from creating value. And I say us because there are many young people like myself and some older people who are recognizing the potential of the metaverse.
It's definitely something that's worth keeping an eye on. It'll be interesting to see how it revolutionizes commerce in existing markets, because you can imagine that there are going to be changing channels of specialization and trade resulting from this new activity as well.
And this is something that you must be interested in as an economist and a libertarian philosopher.
I'm interested in many avenues of human freedom. I think that we need the experimentation to figure out where are the big gains, where are the big bills on the table. There are lots of exciting trends in the century looking forward, but there are also some ominous trends. And I think that it's up to all of us to make sure that the good stuff outruns the bad stuff.
What are
to borrow another metaphor from my mentor, Peter Becky.
What are some of the ominous ones?
Again, just the growth of the state, extension of regulation, more desire for top-down control, the rising stakes of politics as the culture war escalates between the left and the right. These are not very pro-freedom political movements. And so the question is the innovative sector of the economy going to outrun the clamped down desire for top-down political control? That's going to be the big issue over the next couple of decades, I think.
Well, some time ago, Alexander, I would have said, wokeness is nonsense. People are going to mature, but wokeness is really becoming a negative externality. It's being taken way too seriously.
it is being taken way too seriously. And I think ultimately the biggest political goal for anybody, not just libertarians, but everybody, should be lowering the stakes of politics. We care too much about who wins and loses elections because elections determine too much of our lives. We can't have civic friendship with each other when every single election is the most important election ever.
Exactly.
That's just, you cannot have peaceful operations and relations between citizens when you're divided 50% into two warring camps that each regards the other one as morally illegitimate. We got to unwind this thing. We got to walk it back. We need to seize the initiative for self-governance rather than the governance of some by others.
Exactly, Alexander. Every election is inflated as the most significant election in the entire history of the United States, and it's just so silly. It is really dubious, but you're so right. Every election, this election will determine the future of your great grandchildren. Politicians just need to temper their passions and calm down. They like to tell entrepreneurs to temper their passions. They should do the same. But Alexander, we've been speaking for about 1 hour. I really enjoyed the conversation, but unfortunately I have to go. So bye.
Thank you very
Okay
much.
then.
It was my pleasure.
All right then, bye.
Take care.